you. I remember the last time we met, you were a literature student. So how did you
Yeah.
become a writer, and how did it all start for you?
So I have always found my escape and comfort in literature, and I started writing at the age of 10. When I was 10, I had my poems published in national newspapers like Punjab Kesari. I used to write both in English and Hindi. So it all started from there itself, and I always used to be there in the editorial team in my school and college. So writing was always a part of my life, and I did my schooling in science stream, but then I realized that all I want to do in life is write books, and hence I took up literature from Hans Raj. And I wrote my first book when I was in the third year of my graduation, when we were in Hans Raj, and it got published in 2015 then, and it's been going great since the release of my first book. I was invited as a speaker in various events, in literature festivals, college events, and film festivals. So in 2015, I had a book reading session in Gurgaon International Film and Literature Festival, where the book was released by Mr. Sudhir Mishra, the Indian film
Wow, that's
director.
really cool.
The book was also launched by Mr. Petko Doykov, who's the ambassador of Bulgaria to India. So since then, the journey took off, and then I wrote my second book, The Full Circle. Again, through Srishti Publishers, it was published, and it came out in 2018. Then my third book came out in 2020, and amazingly, surprisingly, it was ranked number one in romantic suspense on Amazon within 10 days of release. And then again, my fourth book came out in 2021. It was again ranked number three in Amazon. And I also published a short story recently. The name is If Only Love Was Enough. And it's been going great. I
Wow.
believe that I still have miles to go.
Yes, I think you've been so consistent with your writing. How I like how you actually consistently wrote in a break of at least like 2 years. And while you talk about the full circle, I have this beautiful, beautiful cover. I recently finished reading it and I was absolutely in awe of the characters and the writing and the story. So for all the viewers, I really encourage you to pick The Full Circle. It's a beautifully written novel. So while you were talking about your literary journey, I think Book Ace has a very interesting question for you. So Book Ace wants to
Yeah.
know, is it necessary to study literature if you want to be a writer? So
No, no,
how
no.
much of your literature knowledge helped you to become a published author?
So there are certain aspects that you study in literature. So for example, if I told you that I wrote a Bildungsroman, now you would, as a layman, would not know what a Bildungsroman is, but you would know that if you are a literature student. So a Bildungsroman is basically a novel in which there is a growth of a character. But you don't have to be a literature student to know these things. Like you can always Google stuff up. There's no particular writing knowledge that you get when you are a literature student. It's just that the tropes of, like I told you about buildings romance, such tropes are easier to get access to when you are a literature student.
Yes. So I think I totally agree with Namrata. I'm not a published author yet, but I was also into literature and then I came into the publishing industry. So what we study in literature is how to read text. Yes, there is
Yeah.
some knowledge of writing that we inadvertently we gain, but then primarily our focus is to read the text in a more nuanced manner. Writing, on
Yeah.
the other hand, is a different ball game altogether. It is all about how
Yeah.
you express yourself, how observant you are, how are you able to translate your observations into compelling narratives. While being a
Yeah.
literature student may give you some advantage, but then if you're not a literature student, that does not mean there is absolutely no chance of you becoming a best-selling author. So, for example, a
Yeah.
lot of our best-selling authors, they were not literature students. Chetan Bhagat, for that example, so he wasn't a literature student. Even Ajay Pandey. So, all of them don't
Yeah.
necessarily come from the literature background. They just have a very vivid imagination, very sharp observation skills, and very different way of expression. So I think that is what Namrata was trying to communicate, that when she was in literature, she enjoyed reading text, But then when she was out of it, she started creating her own so that future literature students read her text in the class. So I think that's a pleasure that Namrata, I'm very sure you would be getting. You're just adding to the syllabus of the current literature students. So I think that's the beauty of
Yeah.
studying literature and creating your own. So while you talked about your four novels that you have written, I'm going to ask a slightly, say, challenging question for you. So which out of these four is your favorite novel and why? Which novel did you have the most fun with? Or which novel did challenge you the most? So what would be your pick out of the four?
Okay, so interesting question asking me to pick one of my books. But I think I would go with my debut book, A Silent Promise. That's very, very special to me and very close to my heart because it's about my journey also of being an author. So initially I did not have any idea about how to go about writing stuff, and I just wrote what came into my mind, and I wrote from the heart basically. So that's one book that I wrote only from my heart and without ignoring anything commercial in that regard. So that's the book that I would say is my favorite. And also I the person I was, say when I was 18 years old, I had a growth journey of my own. So the book was inspired in that sense from my own chain of thoughts, how I would look at the world at that time. So that's why, so it has elements of me in it, and also it's very special and it came from the heart. So A Silent Promise for sure.
Oh, yes. I think A Silent Promise has, since it's a Srishti book, I have heard so much about it. It has a very beautiful cover. So, and yes, like whatever you write from your heart actually
Yeah.
plays a very important role in your life. And I was kind of expecting this response. But yeah, I think A Silent Promise is absolutely amazing, and I would really encourage readers to pick that up. So, since you talked about how initially you used to write from your heart, but then later you realize that there are other commercial considerations as well. So,
Yeah.
what is your creative process? So, how do you approach writing and how do you go about creating novels? What is your hack?
So writing for me is like therapy, to put it in simple terms. So whenever I write something or whenever I am forming characters, I go deep within myself into my own personal uh, abyss, and then so it's like inhaling pain and exhaling writing. So I go into the deepest, most wounds or the deepest, most parts of myself, and then I pour it out onto the paper. So that's the process for me. Like, so if I am forming a character, I would shape myself in that character. So I would personally think that I am that character. And if I am that character, how would I react to certain circumstances? And being individuals, we all have certain cultural backgrounds, certain mindsets, certain experiences, life lessons that we go through in our journey. And we also know how a third person would look at that experience. So sometimes there's a shift in your journey. So, for example, the belief system that you had when you were 10 years old, that belief system might not stay with you when you are, say, 20 or 21 years old. So, that
Yes.
complexity and that different perspectives that you basically view a character, I just get that character to be myself and then I analyze from all points of view, and that's how I build characters. And the storyline is similar, so I write the storyline in that way itself, like my journey from. So I am very comfortable in writing in the first person narrative because I can then put myself in that journey and better explain what characters might be going through in that journey. So that's how the
Yes.
process works for me.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting take on it. So, writing for you is a very personal and is a very
Yeah.
introspective process, as opposed to a lot of other authors who tend to make it a very say it is a subjective exercise, but then they are a little more clinical about it, while
Yeah,
you are
yeah.
very introspective and you like to get into the depth of the story and the characters. And I liked when you said that you inhale pain and you say exhale writing and words and verses. So I think that's a beautiful, beautiful analogy. So you write poems as well. So
Yeah.
viewers, she just does not write prose, she writes poems. So how does your creative process differ when you write poetry? Is it the same? Because these two, say,
So,
writing
po
styles are very different. So how do you approach it?
so poetry is a very quick form of writing, right? So you are going through a certain set of emotions at one particular time, and then you pour it out into stanzas. It takes a very short span of time, and it's very spontaneous. It's very in the moment. But when you're
Right.
writing prose, it has to be constructed, it has to be thought of in your mind meticulously, days after days, and you have to also come back to it after certain days. So if I wrote one chapter one day, then I would come back to it after 10 days, right? So
Yes.
it's a prolonged process that takes place, and so it's much more analyzed in that sense. So my poems
Right.
are more spontaneous, and I do not analyze my emotions, which I put into words there. But I do analyze my writing from a critical standpoint when I come back to it, say after 10 days. So that's the difference
Yes.
for me.
That's interesting. I think poetry is a different style of writing, and I like how you are just approaching it in a very different way. And that's important also because that's a very different experience even for the readers. The kind of experience that you get when you're reading prose is very different from the kind of experience that you get when you're reading poems. Poems
Yeah,
are quicker, they are more
yeah,
it's a challenge there because you have to be concise, you have to be rhythmic, and yet you have to convey such profound emotions. Prose give you more space to do the same thing.
yeah.
So I think, and it's great how you write both because that just shows us how versatile you are. So since you spoke about characters, so how do you approach character building? So are these characters all a figment of your imagination, or do you come across them in your real life? How do you get your characters? And since you've written four novels, how do you ensure that they are distinct in their own way? Because when you write multiple novels, there is a tendency to overlap. So how do you make your characters unique?
So my characters have a mix of my thought process and the people I know from somewhere. So it's not like I meet the people and then form a character on them. That's not me. You can share your stories with me. I just give it my personal fiction touch. So for example, if I'm watching a web series and I think there should be a character in this scene which would do this and that, and this character should be shaped like this. Or if I find a
Right.
character outrightly more fascinating than the other characters, then I would build up on that character. Or
Yes.
maybe there are so in the full circle, the protagonist is a traveler. So I
Yes.
personally liked the concept of leaving the 9 to 5 job and being a traveler full-fledgedly very interesting.
Yes.
So I built up a traveler in that book. So it's about who I meet, amalgamated with what I like or what I want to do, set up in a fiction framework so that the characters are relatable also, so that the mass
Yes.
can relate to them and also they have their integrity intact.
Yes. I think I'm glad you talked about Full Circle because as I was telling you, I've read it recently and I was totally enchanted by it. I loved how the worldviews of Aditya and Xenia, they collide because they are two people who believe in very different ways of living. And I
Yeah,
personally liked the character of Aditya a lot. It reminded me of Ranbir Kapoor in Ye Jawani Hai Diwani, where he says, live in the moment and
yeah.
collect your stories and ensure that every same moment is well lived. So suppose if the full circle were to become a movie for you, so who would be your cast, your dream cast? And same for the Silent Promise.
Okay, so for the full circle, I think I would cast Kiara to be
Yes,
Zinnia, and I would
yes,
cast Ranveer Singh to be Aditya because Aditya has a mix of childlike plus mature qualities in him, and I think
yes,
Ranveer Singh plays everything very well. So Ranveer
yes,
Singh for Aditya, and for Zinnia, Kiara Advani, and if it comes to a silent promise, then I think I would take Shraddha Kapoor for
yes,
Avantika because we have
yes,
seen her in that role in Ashiki where she's very
right,
innocent and then she transforms and becomes a singer. So I think I
yes.
would cast her in that role because she's the most recent example to me that comes to my mind.
Yes, I think totally it is going to the cast is really exciting and that is going to make the story all the more amazing. So since we are discussing unconventional love stories and the full circle, a silent promise, it is a very different kind of romance. So
Yeah.
what are some of your unconventional love stories that you may have read recently or possibly something from the past that has actually shaped you in a very profound way? What is your definition of an unconventional love story?
So honestly, all the unconventional stories that I wrote as literature students just pushed me to become an author because I wanted to create those characters.
Yes,
So my personal favorite is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte because in
yes,
that novel we see how a plain girl with a humble background, the world is against her, but she fights to preserve her
yes,
individuality and she doesn't buckle under pressure. She's all there with her real principles and
yes,
doing the feminist movement back in 1800s. So a novel written back in 1800s showing a female protagonist who's so powerful that she won't compromise on her principles and
yes,
that's how she meets three men in her life and finally goes on her way to finding a dream life with her dream husband, changing him for becoming a better person. So,
yes,
contrary to the general expectations that we as women are supposed to conform ourselves as per what the society dictates, she made someone else conform to what an ideal masculinity should be.
yes,
So for me, that's very empowering, and that's the kind of unconventionality that I always look for in my characters and in the plot that I build. The second would be I would say Choker Bali by Rabindranath Tagore. Again, a
yes,
novel, a book written in 1900, showing a widow having liberation, having an independent nature, being sexual about herself. So exploring female sexuality back in 1900, when the idea was so much of a taboo and she was a widow. So
yes,
Binodini, that's a very strong character.
yes,
And again, if I talk about the home and the world, where we
yes,
see Bimla. So being a part of the Swadeshi movement back in 1900, when all you had to do as a woman was take care of the family, being that independent and showing that women have a mind, they can think and they can get attracted by ideas and not just homework. So these are very revolutionary and unconventional topics and characters. They're very empowered. So that's my favorites.
yes. I think that happens to be my favorite too. So Jane Eyre was one of our, say, literature texts, and I remember one of my all-time favorite professors, Arnav sir. She would know. He taught us Jane Eyre so well. Every class that we had with Arnav sir used to be a beautiful experience. And I really like your list of, say, unconventional romance stories because the larger argument that you are trying to make is very relevant. How we need to create characters who just does not merely conform to social norms. They should have that
Yeah,
fire to actually contribute something and to drive a positive change. And that is what make your stories very different from what we are used to seeing, where women do not have any agency, where
yeah.
the action is always driven by the male characters. So I think I totally loved your unconventional romance stories list. So while you spoke about a lot of, say, texts in the 90s, if you had to pick any contemporary unconventional stories, what would that be? So anything recently that you came across which actually captured your mind?
So Norwegian Wood I recently read by Murakami. Again, it
Yes,
shows so it's a story set up in the Japanese culture. So again,
yes,
it shows the journey of an adolescent boy who was in love with a pious girl, and then how he gets attracted to a woman who is liberated at all levels and very independent and fierce in her thoughts. So that graduation or that journey basically from being a little boy who's just venturing into adulthood to finally finding his own identity. I think
yes.
that's very unconventional in that regard because I think there are some reservations when you talk about sexual liberation, that's always a taboo. So
Yes.
that finding that liberation, finding your own identity, exploring yourself, I think that's very unconventional.
Yes, I think Murakami is again a very,
Yeah.
say, very talented author, and he will take you to journeys which will which will leave you totally spellbound. So, while we are talking about contemporary romance stories, what are your favorite contemporary authors that you derive a lot of inspiration from? So, who is your favorite contemporary author that has actually shaped your literary journey?
So I think again Amitav Ghosh would be one because I did not have any interest in historical fiction before I read his books, and he just
Yes.
completely changed my perspective, and he made me a historical fiction reader. So the way he just mixes history with maybe a romance framework or a fiction framework, it's admirable, and I love him for that. So Amitav Ghosh would be one, and I would also name James Patterson. So I read his book Guilty Wives, and although it's in a prison setting, which I had no idea that I could read that kind of a novel, but the
Yes.
book made me visualize even the prison cells. It was so
Okay.
visual, it was so descriptive that I could actually get transported to a prison cell and see the world from the eyes of the protagonist. So James Patterson again, and I love Priti Shenoy ma'am. I love her work, and I think she's
Yes.
also. So I read a book when love came calling, and it was amazing. Like it was the perspectives of both the characters, they were amazing. So I also like her work.
Yes, I think Preeti ma'am. I liked how you named, say, James Patterson, Preeti ma'am, and Amitabh Ghosh in a single line because all three are very different authors, very versatile,
Yeah,
very
yeah,
different socio-political backgrounds, and yet
yeah,
what combines all of them is a very powerful story conveyed
yeah,
in a very compelling manner. So I
yeah,
totally agree. Even I like all the works that Amitabh Ghosh and Preeti ma'am, they have been dominating the literary say industry for such a long time, and that is why, because their writing appeals to each and every reader. So I think that's a great list. So while you spoke about your, say, favorite authors, now I would want to talk more about your writing and publishing, say, journey. So writing and publishing are two very different ball
yeah.
games altogether. There's a difference between a writer and a published author. And I'm very sure we have a lot of viewers here who would want to know more about your publishing journey. You've worked with different publishing houses, you've worked with us, you've worked with other publishing houses as well. So, what are some of the challenges that you encountered during your publishing journey, and how did you overcome it? What was your publishing journey like?
So when I wrote my first book, and so everybody around me told me that to get published, you need to have connections. And that
Yes.
made me fume a bit because I did not have any connections in the industry and I didn't know how to make a place for myself in the industry. So when I wrote my first book, I sent it to like 5 to 6 publishers, including Srishti Publishers. But I really hoped that Srishti Publishers would pick up my book and reply to me because Srishti Publishers gave a voice to new authors, and it was evident at that time. So I really hope that Srishti Publishers like took my book, and when I got a reply from them, I was like, "Oh, I got a reply from Srishti Publishers, yeah!" And that's how my journey began. But there was a lot of dilemmas, like being
Right.
a debut author. Not many people would like to invest in you because, after all,
Yes.
it's a business, right? So people
Yeah.
invest in people where they're sure that they would get a certain sum of money back. Like, but I
Yes.
was a debut author, and changing that mindset was a bit difficult. So that was one challenge, like proving that you can be worth the investment. And
Yes.
secondly, going past that fear that you need to have connections to get published. It's not like that. So
Yes.
that was how the journey started off. And then the biggest challenge that I think I encounter is that not a lot of authors and not a lot of publishers make efforts to stay in touch. So due to this, the marketing side of the book suffers. So
Yes.
all authors and all publishers, like we are connected, should be connected. And so it helps in the visibility of the book, which is a collaborated effort when you are going into traditional publishing. So it's not the fault of the publisher also, because there are just 150 authors and they have so much to do. But
Yes.
just doing little tiny bits can go a long way in making the book
Yes.
successful and visible.
Yes, I think I totally agree. I get publishing is such a collaborative effort,
Yeah,
and we love all our authors. Most of the time, we work with very few authors, but we work very extensively. Namrata would know that there are so
yeah,
many rounds of, say, there's this round of editing, and
yeah.
there's this round of proofreading, and then we work with, say, the social media marketing. So I totally agree that while publishing is a very competitive space, you can always make a place for yourself. You can always leave a mark if you believe in your story. So I'm glad you mentioned how the initial phobia you had was that you were just very, very hesitant to venture because you had
Yeah.
no, say, prior experience or any connections. And that the letting go of that fear is very important to make the first step in any journey, because after all it is the story that matters. It is the story and the author and the conscious effort that the author puts in that really matters in the end. All maybe connections can take you up to a point, but then after
Yeah.
that it's entirely your journey, your talent, your hard work, and your conscious engagement with your readers that steals the show. So I think it's a great conversation, and I'm glad you say spoke about it, because that is going to inspire so many other people to get rid of their fears and just share their stories with the publishers and make their dreams come true. So I think while you spoke about your publishing journey, and I'm very sure when your novel would have been published, there would have been a lot of feedback. So what was your favorite readers' feedback that you got for any of your books?
The general feedback I get, and very proud of it that I get it. So for A Silent Promise, I got one girl reached out to me and said that the Avantika's transformation into an empowered human being has actually helped her to shape her transformation in a similar way. So she had just
Yes,
gotten out of a breakup, and the way Avantika's journey is shown as she grows from being an innocent college fresher to a mature individual, and it's a forced growth. So sometimes we are forced to grow early in life, but
yes,
that's how she coped up with it. That's what inspired that reader, and she came out to me and said that it inspired a similar metamorphosis in her, and it
yes,
inspired her to get past everything that happened and shape her future in a brighter way. So that's the feedback that I really love, because I believe that even if you can enhance one life during your lifetime, it's worth it. And
yes,
I always, through my characters, I always uh, want my readers to reflect on their own lives and make it better. A similar feedback is the one that I got for The Full Circle. So,
yes,
since I told you that The Full Circle is based on the story of a traveler, and being a traveler, Aditya visits a lot of places and meets a lot of people there. So,
yes,
those people come from their own cultural backgrounds, thought processes, their own life experiences. So, for example, some people had low self-esteem in the book, and Aditya helped them become much better people. Some people had suffered from heartbreak, losses. So, how Aditya helped them, gave them a new perspective. So that new perspective helped my reader to get a different take on whatever was going on in his or her life, and then how they took that a shift in perspective as a mindset shift.
Yes.
And then they came back to me with, they said that I was very excited when I wrote that point of view because it changed my entire perspective on the situation that was happening in my life, and it
Yes.
completely made me view my life from a different angle. And I was happy
Yes.
to know that at least I can do a tiny bit for the society of people in general through my pen. So they say that the pen is mightier than the sword. That that's what I aim to do, and that's the kind of feedbacks that I love getting.
Yes, I think those are some beautiful, beautiful feedback. I also love those parts where you vividly describe how so Aditya is very compassionate, and
Yeah,
compassion and empathy are traits that are associated with women more. So I think
yeah,
one thing that actually struck me when I was reading the full circle was that Aditya turned out to be way more empathetic than a lot of women characters in the book. So he is so sensitive, so compassionate. He comes across different people. He wants to know their stories. He wants to work with them. And there is no savior complex within Aditya. So he does
yeah,
not take it upon himself to change the world. He just wants to be a better person himself. And all the, say, experiences that he has in the book when he is helping others to grow, that is consciously making him a better person. So I think that is one aspect that really, say, enchanted me a lot in the full circle. And Aditya is a very different character. The kind of masculinity that he embodies is very different. He's not aggressive. He is not, say, authoritative. There is no hunger for power in him. He is
yeah.
just one human being who wants to live his life to the fullest and ensure that he can change others also and give them a lot of happiness. So I think that's a beautiful take on life in general, and I am not surprised that a lot of readers were able to connect with Aditya and actually implement some of the lessons that he gave in the story in their own lives. So I think that's a great feedback. I'm very sure you'll get a lot of feedback after this session. I would really encourage, say, readers and viewers to pick up Namrata's work. She writes beautifully. She has some very compelling stories to tell, and she creates some very memorable characters. So now that we are nearly at the end of a very exciting conversation, I would want you to, say, give some advice to anybody who wants to venture into the field of writing and publishing. So let me put it this way. If you could go back in time and meet your, say, prior self, your past self, what advice would you give it to her? So now that you have way more experience and knowledge, what are some of the advice and hacks that you would give to anybody who's venturing into publishing?
So from the writing point of view, I would say that whenever you write something, so if I write something today, always come back to it after a few days or maybe tomorrow or maybe a month back, a month later. Always come back to what you have written because when you write, when you're in the moment, you're so engrossed in the setting that you might be missing an alternate point of view or something that could enhance that setting or that scene, something that can add more value because you're so engrossed in that scene. So when you come back to it after a period of time, or maybe just the next day, you come back to it with a fresh perspective, and maybe you can make the scene more engaging. You can add some more perspective to the scene, and that will go a long way in improving how you write.
Yes.
And if I have to talk about non-writing stuff, then I would advise you to just forget the critics, write your heart out, because whenever you write something from your heart, when the writing comes from a place that's deep down within you, that's more full packed with words and emotions, and you're able to convey things with much more passion than how you would if you just think about the critics. Oh, I'll be judged. Don't think like that. Just write from the heart.
Yes, I think right from the heart, that's a very powerful advice because that can just help you overcome so many fears and inhibitions. So I think on that note, I would really like to thank Namrata to to really join this session. I'm glad you gave us so much of time. It has been such a wonderful conversation. We talked about writing, we talked about publishing, we talked about unconventional romance stories. And one thing that I want all of us to take away from this session is her advice right from the heart. Whatever you do in life, do with a lot of heart, with a lot of positive intention. And I am sure somewhere later it is going to make you a better person and it is going to make you feel so proud of yourself. So before we close the session, any last word, Namrata? The stage is yours. You have a lot of viewers. What would you like to say to them?
Please go through my books, and I would like you to tell me how you like my books. If there's anything that you did not like, if there's any critical viewpoint, I'm always open. I'm always open for great transformation, and I'll always see if I can incorporate your advice in the future works. So please, please, please read my books and get back to me with your reviews.
Yes, I think taking it forward, I would really like to show this beautiful cover of The Full
I also
Circle
have.
again. Yes, I think it's a great novel, and I completely agree with Namrata. So this holds true even for the editors and for the publishers. Whenever the book is released, we actually sit in front of Amazon and we are always looking for reviews because that is a great source of learning for us as well. Because that shows us what is working with the readers, what is not working with the readers, and that is what gives us also the motivation to publish the stories which you like to read. So just emphasizing what Namrata said, while you finish the story, please review it, rate it, reach out to your author, reach out to your publisher, tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, and let's hope that through this process, we become better at giving you stories that change your life and you become a better version of yourself through the stories that we publish. So, on that note, I would like to thank Namrata again and all the viewers who joined our session today. Thank you so much once again, Namrata, and have a
Thank
lovely
you.
evening to you and to all the viewers. So, with that, I close this wonderful episode of Book Talk with Srishti. I'll meet you next week with another exciting episode. Till then, take care, everyone, and bye. Bye, Namrata.
Bye.